Somewhere in the breeding archives of faraway farm sits a ledger that bloodstock agents stopped referencing after 1940, not because the data was wrong, because it was too right, and what it revealed about inheritance, greatness, and the brutal ceiling of biology was something the racing industry had built its entire economic model to ignore. The ledger tracked the progeny of the most physically dominant thoroughbred ever measured by modern science. It tracked what happened when his bloodline was given every advantage money, land, and veterinary expertise could provide. And what it showed, race after race, foal after foal, across 2 decades of careful breeding, was that the thing that made man-o'-war impossible could not be passed on. Not fully, not even close. That is the story no one wanted to tell when he was alive. It is the story science has spent 80 years quietly confirming. Man-o'-war was not fast the way racehorses are fast, he was fast the way industrial machinery is fast, not through elegance alone, but through a convergence of mechanical advantages so improbable that veterinarians who examined him used language they typically reserved for anomalies, not athletes. His stride length measured 28 feet. The average thoroughbred at peak extension covers between 20 and 23. That gap, 5 to 8 feet per stride, compounded over 1.25 miles becomes a different race entirely. Not a faster version of the same contest. A different physical event, governed by different arithmetic. His heart, when measured post-mortem, weighed 22 pounds. The breed standard hovers around 8. Secretariat's famous oversized heart, the one that launched 1,000 documentaries and reshaped how the industry thought about cardiac output, weighed 22 pounds as well. That number is not a coincidence, it is a threshold. Below it, you have exceptional racehorses. At it, you appear to have something the sport produces perhaps once per generation, if that. Man-o'-war reached that threshold decades before anyone had the instruments to fully understand what it meant. The industry understood one thing clearly: they wanted more of him. Breeders, owners, and syndicate managers in the 1920s approached Man-o'-war's reproductive potential the way engineers approach a proven blueprint. The logic seemed airtight. His father, Fair Play, had produced a champion. His dam, Mahuba, carried the bloodline of rock sand. The inputs were documented, pedigreed, traceable. If you bred the greatest thoroughbred alive to mares of equivalent quality, the output should approach the original. This was not sentimentality. This was applied genetics, as the era understood it. Breed the best to the best, they said. Hope for the best. They got good horses, exceptional horses, by any reasonable standard. They did not get Man-o'-war. War Admiral, perhaps his most celebrated son, won the Triple Crown in 1937. That sentence alone should end the argument. Triple Crown winners are not failures. War Admiral was brilliant, compact, aggressive, possessed of a competitive fury that his sire would have recognized. But War Admiral stood 15 hands and 3 inches, Man-o'-war stood 16 hands and 2. That is not a rounding error in thoroughbred terms. That is a different frame, a different leverage equation, a different relationship between stride and speed. War Admiral's Triple Crown was earned through will and talent. Man-o'-war's records were broken through what now appears to have been biomechanical inevitability. The son was great. The father was something that does not have a clean scientific category. American Flag, another son, won the Belmont Stakes. Clyde Van Dusen, though out of a different dam, carried the sire's influence into a Kentucky Derby. Battleship, his son out of a different bloodline entirely, won the Grand National at Aintree, a steeplechase course that rewards a completely different set of physical and mental attributes than the flat. These were not ordinary horses, they were champions, plural, and they could not replicate the father in any of the measurements that actually mattered when studied against the data. Here is why, and the answer lives inside a branch of genetics that the 1920s breeders had no vocabulary for. Mitochondrial DNA passes exclusively through the maternal line. This is not theory, it is established cellular biology. The mitochondria within a thoroughbred's muscle cells, the structures responsible for converting oxygen into usable energy during sustained high-intensity exercise, are inherited entirely from the dam. Man-o'-war's sire contributed nothing to this system in his offspring. Whatever mitochondrial efficiency existed within Man-o'-war's extraordinary aerobic capacity, and the post-mortem evidence suggests it was extraordinary, was a product of his dam's lineage, not his own genetics in any form he could directly pass forward, but the damage to the breeder's dream runs deeper than mitochondria. The traits. that made Man-O-War what he was: the stride length, the cardiac mass, the bone density measured at the cannon bone and described by one veterinarian as approaching the structural profile of a draft animal in a racehorse's body, are polygenic. They are not controlled by one gene, or two, or five. They emerge from the interaction of dozens of loci across multiple chromosomes, each contributing a fractional increment to the final phenotype. When you breed a horse who expresses those traits at maximum, you are not creating a horse who carries a single dominant gene for greatness. You are working with a genetic lottery ticket that happened to come up perfectly. The next ticket drawn from that same pool, even with an identical sire, is subject to the full, indifferent machinery of recombination. Regression to the mean is not a failure of breeding, it is mathematics operating exactly as designed. Man-O-War's offspring regressed, not catastrophically, not into mediocrity, but measurably, undeniably, back toward the statistical center of the thoroughbred population, a population that was itself already elite, which is the cruelest irony of all. His sons and daughters were champions among champions. And still the gap between them and their father was wide enough to drive a sulky through. The necropsy performed on Man-O-War at Faraway Farm in 1947 was thorough by the standards of its era. The veterinarian's notes, preserved in the archive that nobody quotes anymore, are clinical to the point of coldness. Stride mechanism intact, musculature consistent with an active specimen decades younger. Cardiac mass, 22 pounds. Cannon bones, density described in terms more commonly applied to warm bloods bred for heavy agricultural work, not sprint athletes. And a final notation that reads less like a medical observation and more like a confession, that the assembled measurements, taken together, represent a convergence of physical attributes that the attending physician had not encountered in 30 years of equine practice and did not expect to encounter again. He was right, no one has encountered it again, not in the bloodline, not in the breed. The industry spent the better part of 3 decades waiting for Man-O-War's genetic gift to resurface in a grandson, or a great-grandson, or a great-great-grandson. Breeders traced his influence through Native Dancer, through Bold Ruler, through the long shadow he cast across the American thoroughbred gene pool. His descendants are everywhere in modern pedigrees, statistical ghosts embedded in the foundation stock of every major racing nation. Yet the specific configuration that produced him, that 28-foot stride, that cardiac engine, that bone structure that let him carry 138 pounds at 40 miles per hour without apparent mechanical strain, has not reassembled itself in any foal born since 1917. Some biologists who study elite animal performance use the phrase phenotypic extreme to describe what Man-O-War represented. It is precise language. It means that within a given population, subject to the constraints of that population's genetic diversity, he expressed every relevant trait at or near its theoretical maximum simultaneously. A horse can have an exceptional heart but average stride. A horse can have extraordinary stride but standard cardiac output. The combination of maxima, every advantageous variable expressing at its ceiling at the same moment, is not just rare. It may be, by strict population genetics, unrepeatable within the same bloodline across a human lifespan or longer. His owners knew none of this in 1919 when they retired him to stud. They knew only what the stopwatch said. They knew that he had won 20 of 21 starts, that the one loss came under a burden of weight and a procedural disadvantage his connections protested for years. They knew that crowds of 40,000 people pressed against railings not to watch a race but to watch him warm up because the warm-up alone was worth the trip. They knew, in the language available to them, that they had something unprecedented. They believed, reasonably, that unprecedented things could be reproduced. Biology had other plans. What remains, then, is the question that the data cannot answer, even now. We know the stride length. We have the cardiac weight. We have the race times, the handicap records, the testimony of jockeys who rode him and described the experience in terms that sound less like sport and more like operating a mechanism that had been calibrated beyond the tolerances of ordinary horseflesh. We have the offspring records, the champion sons and daughters who were, by every external measure, proof that the bloodline carried something exceptional forward, even if not everything. What we do not have is an explanation for the specific convergence. The genetics are documented, the phenotype is measured, the inheritance patterns are clear, yet the gap between what the science predicts should have been possible and what actually appeared on that track, 28 feet of earth consumed per stride, a heart twice the size of reason, bone that should have belonged to a plough animal carrying a silked-up jockey toward finish lines that arrived before rivals had reached their own top speed, that gap remains open. Perhaps that is the only honest conclusion. Man-o-war happened once. The archive at Faraway Farm confirms it. The breeding records confirm it. 80 years of carefully managed bloodlines, each one carrying fragments of what he was, confirm it. Greatness of that specific and unmeasurable kind does not duplicate. It arrives unrepeated, burns through a single lifetime of 20 races and 30 years at stud, and then recedes into the genetic background of a breed that still carries his name in its pedigrees and still cannot produce his equal. The data is all there. The laboratories have run the analysis. The stride has been reconstructed from film and compared to modern champions with the precision of forensic science. And still, when you stand in front of the archived photographs, the ones where he is simply standing in a paddock, not racing, not performing, just existing in the particular way that is, to something built at the edge of biological possibility exists, the measurements feel insufficient. The numbers feel like a description of weather when what you are actually trying to explain is lightning. He was not a horse who produced great horses. He was a horse who produced evidence that he himself should not have existed. And in a sport built on the promise that greatness is heritable, that may be the most defiant thing he ever did.